right, hello and welcome back. This is Jeff Scott, talking JavaScript courtesy of Murox JavaScript 2nd edition. We're in the middle of Chapter 4, and you can see I still have the array stuff up. So, I'm going to move on from there. And one of the things that's discussed on page 123 in the book is if at the top of your program, at the top of your Java program, you put in double quotes, use strict in your JS file. Before anything else, you type in double quote, use strict, double quote, or you can use single quotes with a semicolon. What that does is it puts you into strict mode. When you code in strict mode, I should say, if you forget to use the var keyword in a variable declaration, the JavaScript engine will throw an error. If you spelled something like, let's say that you've got a variable name that's, that's called hello, H-E-L-L-O, but you accidentally spell it H-E-L-O, again, the JavaScript engine will throw an error. Now, this became available in JavaScript ECMA script 5. And the significance of that is that the strict mode will not work in IE7, IE8, or IE9. Now, if you look up on the screen right now, what we have here is at least some general best coding practices. Use local variables whenever possible. Use the var word when declaring all variables. Use strict mode. And declare the variables that are used in a function at the start of the function. Again, what is happening here is we are coming up with a standard. And it's very important that you do that. So here's the stuff that we've talked about. All right, and all of that's in there should make sense to you by now. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about handling events. I do want to mention one last thing to you, though, before we do. All right, there's 2 more chapters, and then we're done with Section 1. Now, when we go into Section 2, it begins with talking more about numbers, strings, and dates, things we've already touched on, but it's going to touch on them in more detail. Then in Chapter 7, or that is Chapter 7, I'm sorry. So strings, numbers, and dates. Then in Chapter 8, more on control statements. So more on looping, more on selection statements. Then we go into Chapter 9, how to work with arrays, and also how to use web storage. So even more on arrays. Then we go to Chapter 10. Here's a surprise, how to create and use functions. So more on functions. All right. The reason that I'm telling you all that is not to waste my time and not to waste your time, but to let you know that all this stuff that we've been talking about, we are going to continue to talk about it in later chapters. All right. Okay. JavaScript applications commonly respond to user interactions like clicking a button. All right. So an event handler is a function that gets executed when an event occurs. In other words, it's handling the event. If you want to attach an event handler to an event, you first specify the object and the event that triggers it. Then you assign the event handler function to that event. And if that confuses you, we're going to look at examples in just a minute. When you code the event for an event handler, you must proceed it with on. For example, for the click event, it's on click. You can create a function expression as an event handler and attach it to an event. When you do it this way, you don't quote parentheses after the variable name. You can also create and attach an event handler in one step, and we'll see that in just a minute. Now, when we start looking at examples, so these are some of the events. All right, those are the objects, on load, on click, on focus, etc. Loaded into memory, clicking, like clicking a button or something, when something gets the focus, when something loses the focus, when, for example, you are working with text box and you start typing into it, when you select something, click, I already mentioned, but so that's the window can respond to that, buttons to this, different controls to this, other controls to this, elements to this. All right? So if you look at the example that's right here, this first example, you see the syntax, all right? You see in this first example, an example of the syntax for attaching an event handler. The function is stored in a variable. The variable is named joinList, and it displays a message. In an actual application, it could do a lot more than that. If we keep going on, the next example here shows how to attach an event handler to a button click. Now notice what's here. It says submit button.onClick equal join list. Notice what's missing here and here. There are no parentheses. If you put the parens, it would actually call the function. But you're not trying to call the function right there. As the text says, you are trying to attach an event handler. So you're letting it know that when that happens, that is the event that should be called. So you're attaching the event handler, not calling it. That's why the function won't be called until the click event is fired. If you were to put parameters after the join list, the function would be called right away. And again, that's not what we want to do. So this chapter ends with a couple of examples. All right, the first one is that email list that we've looked at before. But it's a little bit different in that I guess it's actually a simpler example. Because let's see if we have it here. There it is. That's the whole thing. All right. And in the JavaScript that you see, that's the miles per gallon. I guess did they not show the other JavaScript? There it is. All right. The first thing that you see is, again, we use that alias up on the top. So what we're saying is anytime you use a $sign, treat it as though we did a return of document.getElementById. All right. Then we are saying that when we click a button, what we want to have happen is we want the join list function to be called. When we change the value that's in the text box, we want the change value function to be called. And then finally at the end, this is where we're doing that attaching. So the event handler for the onload event of the window object can be used to attach event handlers for other events. And again, you're going to see this later on more as we go more and more deeper and deeper into the book. All right, couple more things. Pages 128 and 129 start with these two illustrative applications. The first is they go back and they redo the miles per gallon. Now you'll notice this looks a lot more professional. For example, this is the kind of program you could stick on a web page. The other one with the alerts and stuff looks a little bit more amateurish. All right? So this would be that miles per gallon program in a browser. This time it uses text boxes and a button rather than prompt and alert boxes. The version gets the user entries for the miles and the gallons inside, the miles driven, the gallons used. Those two are presented by the user. Then when you click the button, it calculates the miles per gallon and automatically rounds it to 1 decimal place and then displays it on the page. You may or may not be able to tell from the picture here, but you can if you look at the code on page, or the example on page 129 from where this picture is taken. The disabled attribute has been set for the third text box because you shouldn't be able to enter into that because that's the calculated field. So what's shown next is the code, all right? And again, it's very important that you start to look at the code that's in here and be able to understand what's going on. Notice at the beginning of the script tag, and again, I wish they would have done this as a separate file, but they didn't. There's the use strict. Then again, we've got our shortcut or alias. Then we come in here and calculate MPG is a variable that we assign to the results of the function. The function gets miles and gallons passed in. It divides miles by gallons, puts it into MPG, and then rounds that to 1 decimal place and returns it. All right, the process entries function does a parse float on miles, whatever value you put in there, does a parse float on gallons for whatever value you put in there. Then it says if miles is not a number or if gallons is not a number, you just put up an alert that says both entries must be numeric. Otherwise, notice what you say, MPG, which is the ID of this, is equal to the result of that function. And then finally at the end, you come in and you attach the event handlers. Please take the time to read the end of this chapter, especially pages 128 through 133, those 5 or 6 pages, because event handling is got to be something that becomes very natural to you. Next, they do the same kind of thing, but they've got, again, the email thing that they did earlier, and they redo that. The data validation that's done on this application is pretty typical of client-side validation done for any form before it's submitted. So if we look at the code that's here on page 133, there's a lot of stuff in here. All right, it changed because it's more DOM-oriented than the stuff you saw before. That's the HTML, but here's the code. All right, that looks, hopefully at least, it makes some sense. That looks pretty much like what we talked about before until you get down where it says validate the first entry, and you can see that in yellow. So now notice email address error dot first child dot node value. Now we're DOM programming. Okay, we're still checking for an empty email address, and we're still checking for an empty second one. We're still checking to see whether or not the email addresses are the same. But just so you know, there's a lot more validity checking that could be done here. We're not checking to see, we're not doing any kind of, for example, regular expression checking to make sure that what we're putting in there for an email address is indeed an email address. That may not sound important, but I could put Jeff in there for both of them, and as long as the Jeff was spelled the same way, it would pass. That's not the way we want this to happen. All right. Again, if you look at the end of the chapter, because we're done. So this chapter talked about event handling and how to respond to different kinds of events. But it's interesting that they show this graphic here. This is exercise 4-1. All right, I'm not still sure yet what the exact homeworks are going to be, but whether something like 4-1 is assigned or not assigned, if you want to start to really understand this stuff, go and do an exercise like 4-1. See if it makes sense to you. If it makes sense to you, great. If it doesn't, then you go and you consult the instructor or the lab assistant and you say, hey, I tried to do this and it didn't work. Can you help me? That's their jobs. All right? So I'll be back with the next chapter in a couple minutes.